And now Dr. Bowman, Paul has become my partner. I've presented this contact with Miguelina. Last week I did it for the entire Delaware Psychological Association. And so it's really started to pick up some momentum. Today, what I really want us to do is just revisit the model. I have some new exercises that maybe if you've been to this training before, you've never done. If you've been to this training before, some little things may tweak. Based on the amount of time we have, is going to really determine how much depth we go into the experiential training. But if you find, wow, that was really great, I wish we had more time, you have time every other month. So it can be an ongoing conversation. And I have to say, I may speak just for myself, but I have found the bi-monthly trainings for CBC to be inspirational. Last month, I mean, come on, what y'all, come on. Yeah. Was it not the truth? It was amazing, right? It was so good. I was like, I should send an email and say what it was, but how could we capture that? I know, see people shaking their heads. So anytime I invite you all for this presentation, I have a more casual style. If you like anything I say, the choir is welcome to go, to really honor the spirit of culture. And so in the first part, I want to just say transparency. I love this. I think talking about culture is really important. This space is not a confidential space. It is a semi-confidential space. I hope if you share any stories or things that people said or say in this space that you will de-identify that. But sometimes sharing about the comments people make in CBC can also help improve other people's competency. So I say that to really encourage you all to keep yourself safe. Don't share more than you're comfortable with. You don't have to go into your most challenging patient experience if that's not helpful for you. But if it is, let's create some space to support each other. Also, one of the biggest barriers to cultural competency is political correctness. Let's all assume that if someone says something that might be offensive or in a way that's not politically correct, it was in the spirit of learning and not in the spirit of being offensive. Can we all agree that we can create that assumption with each other? I'm going to assume everyone means the best thing. And I hope we can do that, give that same gift to each other. So countertransference, some people hate the word. I've heard from some people, I'm not psychodynamic, I'm not psychoanalytic, this has nothing to do with me. Yes, it does. I don't have a better term for countertransference. If you can come up with a better term, I'll give you an authorship. So right now, the term is countertransference. What I'm talking about specifically, first we can start with Freud's analysis, and I think that's where a lot of people are turned off by countertransference. It really looked at things, any experiences that you had related to your patient, any feeling you had related to your patient or your client was negative because we're supposed to be the tabula rasa, or that blank slate. That's not what I'm talking about. I don't think it's negative to feel things about your patient. Freud did. The totalistic approach was that anything conscious or unconscious in thinking about your patient was countertransference. Just thinking about your patient, that's countertransference. We're not using that model either. What I'm really talking about is more of a contemporary reaction. This has to do with how therapists' reactions are a result of maybe some unresolved issue that they have or an unconscious belief that they've had. It has to do with the extent that that content within the patient session or that interaction with a colleague might be triggering those unresolved issues. I also think that it can be an extremely valuable therapeutic tool and a really great way to connect with our patients. I think we've been able to really talk about that a lot in CBC, which has been really powerful for me. So talking about culture and all of that, I gave some definitions, but none of those three descriptions actually had the word culture in them. The thing about countertransference, it's been very limited in talking about culture, and when it does, it's just one aspect, like race or gender, as if we're not all multicultural beings and carry multiple cultural identities with us at every point in our lives. So when I think about culture, it's actually a silent participant in every single interaction that you're having, down to the name that someone calls you. So in the longer trainings, the 8-hour trainings, one of the things that I do is called What's in a Name. And I pair people off to really just talk about what their name means. Do they like their name? Are they called the name that they're born with? And I think this can be a really powerful way sometimes to connect with our families even when we talk about the names that they've chosen for their children and their naming practices and healthy steps if the mom is pregnant, talking about those things and what they really want their child's name to mean. An example of what this process might look like: Dana, that's my government name. The fact that I even call it my government name, I think indicates a certain level of thought related to that name. My mom chose the name Dana because it was gender neutral. She didn't feel like it could be black or white, it could be anything. And so she felt like this was a name that would be very protective and help guide me through the world in ways that people wouldn't be prejudiced against me on my resume. So, Dana. But that's not really me. Outside of this space, most people call me Free, which is my nickname, because it was another Dana at one point, and they were like, man, Dana, you like that free spirit. So people started calling me Free. I actually prefer that name. But Dr. Crawford is threatening to kill both of those people and all of the responsibilities that I have and what it means to be a doctor. And so all of those things have cultural points, access to resources, experiences with oppression, my own connection with the name, and it's the very first thing that people see, even before they meet me in my email. So much is anchored in a name. How many times have you looked at a patient's name in Epic and made certain assumptions about who they are? Right? So even this is a point of culture. And so when I say it's a silent participant, even from the very first referral. So, when we talk about this idea of culture-based countertransference and why it's particularly relevant, I really think that at this point in our career, we've all had experiences working in diverse settings, right? Everyone here, you're in the Bronx. Diverse may be related to you, related to society's definition of diversity, those numbers that you see in big businesses, what have you. And I don't think any of us chose to work in the Bronx and Lower Westchester County because we felt like, man, I really want to work with my majority group members who look a lot like me, who have had access to many different resources, right? So if you choose to work here, I think there's some kind of mindset already, an assumption that you have certain beliefs that are about equality and understanding oppression and things of that sort. But just your desire alone to not be prejudiced or biased is not enough. And so thinking about CBC, it's really about recognizing that our experiences as clinicians is not going to automatically diffuse the reality that we have all been exposed to racism, prejudice, bias, homophobia, and other isms in our society. We know very clearly that there are concrete outcomes to diversity not being a prominent part of training, health disparities, effective treatments, premature termination, coerced treatment. All of these things are part of the things that are really related to not recognizing the role of culture in people's lives. How many of you were at the New York Times study that talked about? I see some head nods. Basically what we found is black mothers in particular are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth, or for those babies to die in childbirth, compared to their same peers in the white community. So much so that even when socioeconomic status is controlled for, so say a black mom who's a doctor, she is 3 to 4 times more likely to die than a white teen mom who might be living in a trailer, who has no college education. And so even controlling for education, controlling for socioeconomic status, access to health care, we still see that there's a huge epidemic of black moms dying in childbirth and babies dying that are born to black mothers. And I point this study out, one, because I think it's really important for us to be familiar with that study because it is getting huge. I mean, NPR has been covering it. It's everywhere. So I think it's just an important conversation in peds. But I think it's another important point because literally what it says is that racism can kill you. So we're not just talking about CBC because this is a warm, fuzzy thing and it's important and we should talk about it and we're psychologists, but literally we're talking about a life-threatening situation here. And it has to do with cortisol. When you have higher levels of cortisol, you see all of these really horrific outcomes, low levels, pretty bad outcomes, and all of that is responses that's theorized to racism and being in a racist environment. And so one of the things that I've kind of said is kind of anecdotally is that this bias, this prejudice that we all have is something that we all have. It's not something that we can avoid. it's literally in the air we breathe. It's pollution. I think it's a human epidemic. One day maybe we will find a cure for it, but thinking about it in that way can really start to decrease some of the pressure or the guilt or the judgment that might be associated when we talk about having cultural biases. So this model, this is the countertransference model. It was developed by Hayes and his colleagues. And really what he developed here was this idea of countertransference being a really vague theoretical concept. And so in this, he said, well, it's not just your reactions to patients, but like, how do we really operationalize this? How can this really be a conversational approach to discussing countertransference? So the first piece, he said, has to do with the origins, your own experiences. That has to do with what you grew up with, who you grew up around, what messages were conveyed about your culture as you were experiencing the world. So that might be your family of origin. That may also be media. That may be your experiences with friends and peers and colleagues and all of those things. And you may not have necessarily agreed with those messages. Actually, I think that often leads to some unresolved issues because there's conflict, especially when you go home for the holidays, if you celebrate holidays. And so this piece has to do with all those unresolved issues. Then he said, when those issues are unresolved, they're fine until someone triggers them. Or something triggers them. Some type of stimulus makes you think about those things. And then when you're triggered, you have a reaction. That reaction is what do you actually do when you're starting to think about some of those reactions to the patient in the room or maybe with colleagues. How you handle that, what consequence that has, those manifestations, is also part of the process. And then finally, what's that management? I'll talk more specifically. I'm just talking theoretically here. And so just for the people who are more visual learners, this is just kind of a summary of those different models, the origins, the triggers, the manifestations, the consequences, and the management factors. And so in that study that Hayes did in developing his structural model, he really just pointed out that culture was only relevant specifically within this origins piece. And so what he found is that race and gender were really the unresolved cultural issues that happened. And he didn't go into how culture could be a stimulus and all of those different pieces. And so when I was writing my dissertation and really trying to figure out this idea of countertransference, I started to say, race and gender, that's not the only aspect of culture. There's so many different components. And over the years, I've just continued to add. Originally, this was from Beulah, and now I've just added more. So we have race, gender, age, socioeconomic status, religion, and so forth. In your handout, would you mind opening your handout for me, Alba, this one right here? In your handout, there is a cultural origins quiz on page 3. If you notice there are 3 blanks. Those blanks are for possible other cultural identities that I haven't included here. What are some other cultural identities that might be particularly relevant for you that are not indicated here? And I'm asking that of the room.
Profession.
Tell me more.
Well, our professions are almost like, I can make the similarity to being in a kind of fraternity. You're chosen into it, you spend most of your time, you learn from the people that are within that umbrella under your profession in that. So, I mean, you may become isolated from other people that may be chosen into a different kind of profession or a different kind of fraternity. So.
I agree 100%. Psychologists, psychiatrists. Definitely different cultural norms there. Social work, I'm putting out some things out there. Psychology, psychiatry, there's some different cultural norms there. One of the first questions, what do you do for a living? That's very cultural. Christina.
I'm going to say, like, status as a parent or not. We just had a whole conversation at lunch about, like, being a parent and the challenges, and I think especially in the work that we do, that has a big impact. Parents ask that question a lot.
Yeah, I definitely feel an identity shift becoming a parent. I agree. Kate, good point. Thank you.
Geographic location. Like
within a country versus between countries?
Yeah, so even different from nationality.
Borough.
Even borough. I was recently on the train and I overheard someone say, oh, and they live in the Bronx, and someone's like, oh, that's horrifying. And I was like, I hate public transportation. And so like even that level of borough, I feel like I'm completely an East Coaster. Just the pace that I present in. I think of presenting this in different regions. I need twice as much time because I'm an East Coaster and we keep it moving, which I love. Other identity points that maybe aren't included here. Yes,
Like immigration
definitely.
status, or even if you're first generation or second generation.
Yeah, I think at the last training I did, they called it assimilation status, like how assimilated you are. And I think that's a different thing than citizenship or nationality, but I think all of those things are such big components. At the last training, someone said language as in spoken words, but they felt like there should be another box on technology. And like technology being its own language and understanding it, and I thought that was pretty interesting.
I think if you, so I used to actually, I did this many years ago, but I'd compare like, so my grandparents survived the Holocaust, and I was asking questions of American Jews whether their grandparents survived the Holocaust, because I was picking up on some subtle differences in our, and I think it was really trauma informed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just, yeah, like you having, I guess, part of your multicultural identity is, or do you come from significant trauma? Like
Yeah.
that in itself could be.
I think it definitely fits. There's a whole body of research that looks at post-traumatic slave syndrome. I can't think of the scholar right now, but she looks at all of the generational things, and the research has shown that there are differences in cortisol in specifically from maternal survivors of the Holocaust down to 3 to 4 generations after, and the great-granddaughters of those Holocaust survivors, which, I mean, that's a biological anchor of culture. So I think that's huge. Wonderful. Katie in the back.
I think it'd be maybe kind of like an offshoot or next to sexual orientation would also be like relationship status. Thinking of who I am, I think of who I also surround myself with,
Yeah.
who I align closely with, and how that's changed over time.
Yeah, I think one piece is like community anchoring, like who you surround yourself with. But I remember when I knocked on 24's door, when are you getting married? Those kind of questions, and do you believe in marriage and all of that? And so I definitely think that's a cultural identity. Erica?
Military affiliation.
Yeah, I used to have military on here, and then I added political affiliation, and the bubbles were too big for the screen. But I definitely agree. It should be. And in a military audience, I would put the bubble back, but it just didn't fit. It wasn't cute. And so what I invite you all to do now, maybe for people who are not more vocal and have more of an internal reflection approach, or you heard some that were particularly relevant, you can write down those additional identities on page 3. Right, you can write that now. For you, personally. And so, you know, just to kind of summarize the point, when we talk about this idea of culture-based countertransference, what I've developed now is a really a 4-point bullet of the definition of countertransference. And it has to do with our culturally held assumptions, stereotypes, norms, beliefs, values, our attitudes related to our multicultural identities. So I might identify as one thing, but the world perceives me as another, and that is actually relational. You alone don't get to define your multicultural identity. Other people say, well, you don't look this enough, or you look like this, and I perceive you this way, and I'm going to do these things to you or interact with you based on how I perceive your cultural identity. Your world views, political, religious, moral views, and then the influence of your family of origins, beliefs, and those intergenerational messages. And so now when we think about this model of countertransference, it has color in it. And that color represents culture. And the diversity of those colors represent the diversity of how much we're talking about what the word culture means. It's not just this one idea of race and gender. And so what I've really tried to succinctly do is develop this model, the AIM model of awareness, identification, and the management of culture-based countertransference. The awareness of our origins, the identification of our triggers, knowing what they are and how that manifests, and then finally, the management. How do you manage those experiences, and what impact does that have on your clinical work or your experiences in the world? So we're going to start with just talking about the awareness, and we're going to work through the AIM model. So one of the things about origins, I talk about this unresolved piece, is that those same identities can be triggers of great difficulty, inconvenience, shame, or you might have a great sense of pride, or maybe it gives you a particular benefit. For me, one of my identities has to do with my body. I'm a tall woman. I find when I navigate the world, I think it may be different. I don't know. I've been tall since I was born. I think I may feel differently than maybe a woman who has a different size. I feel like when I walk down the street at night, I don't feel as scared as maybe I would if I had a more petite frame. I think when I speak sometimes, people just assume certain things when you're tall. I've heard from some of my friends who are not as tall as me that sometimes they're not taken as seriously just because of their height and those kind of things. And on the same side, it's very inconvenient because I can never find pants long enough. And so both benefits and shame or inconvenience. Shame because as a kid, I've been this tall since 6th grade. I was really bullied, and it was a huge source of constant conversation and the assumption that I was older. So like the navigating the world as a tall child, people assume things and expect bigger things from you, even though you're like, I'm 4, and they're like, you're 9. Why are you not able to do math? And so those kind of things, it may be times that there is more pride and there is more shame, and that continuum may be at different points in your life. Every time I do this, I'm like, this is not accurate. I need to update it. And it was just last week. It kind of is like, where am I at with this cultural identity, and where's the world? I definitely felt different about my cultural identity post this current election than the last one. Talk about pride. I went to inauguration. I did not do that this time. I did not. That was not one of my choices. I find that when I was a younger therapist, age was a source of pride. I was so cool. I was hip. Like, I was in the room with the kids. Like, I knew every artist. Now, when kids are like, oh my gosh, you're so cool. You're like the same age as my grandma. Mind you, a lot of our patients have younger grandmothers. But that has now become a bit of an inconvenience, and sometimes I don't care so much about it. So it really cannot just be based on your experiences, but it may be at where you are in your current experience.
I feel like it also could even fluctuate between like environments you have throughout the day, like where you are like at work versus where you are at home. Like it just seems like there could really shift like very quickly depending on where you are.
Exactly, you're brilliant. That piece of that is the awareness, to recognize it on a regular basis. It's not a stable thing. Culture is not a stable thing. I'm not just this identity. I don't just have these relationships and then it's done. And that speaks to the piece that it's always ongoing, that awareness, even down to the day, and the minute in the day. So this is one of the exercises we do in CBC. We're not going to do that here. This is just an example. But I think it's really important to ask, like, where do these thoughts and feelings come from? I alluded to some of them, but really, a lot of it has to do with these family of origin points. Similar, we're all pediatric psychologists anchored in attachment and all of those things. So one of the ways that we can really explore where these ideas come from is this concept of a cultural genogram. Now, originally when I developed the model, I would have people do a cultural genogram at the 8-hour training. I would get color pencils out, and it was psychologists, so the circles had to be perfect. I had to get rulers, and it would take like 2 hours of the training just drawing the genogram. And then I would have people, well, who in your family was racist? Who in your family was prejudiced in this area? Who was homophobic? Who was this? And I didn't find that to be particularly the best use of time. So the way that I've modeled it now is doing like a snippet, like a snapshot of cultural origins. And we're going to do this today. This is a sample. So for me, I just picked 3 cultural identities. If you look at your handout on page 3, I just put 2 there. You can add whichever ones you want. And if you don't want to have an add, there's already race, there's already gender. gender there based on Hayes' model. I included those two as a reference for that model. And then it's going to ask you how much you agreed, disagreed, or you're unresolved in that family member related to that concept of race and ethnicity. So for example, my maternal grandmother says really disturbing things sometimes that I don't particularly appreciate related to her safety with white people. Now, she grew up in a different era. She does not feel safe, and she's always saying things like, you know, a lot of white people, are you gonna be safe? So the questioning of my safety, like, I really appreciate someone caring about my safety, but I don't think it has to do with them being white. And okay, but also I want to be respectful of my grandma, and she's like an elder and she knows a lot of stuff. So I feel kind of unresolved in this and how to have that conversation. Also related to my grandfather and age, he felt like no matter what your age, he would say if you were a young fool, you'll be an old fool. You know, you don't outgrow dumb. Which I really appreciate, and I agree with that a whole lot, that throughout your lifetime you have to be constantly fresh and engaged in who you are. And then I think about, you know, some areas around gender. I left this blank. My husband and I, we don't have that gender role stuff. We're just kind of surviving this, having a toddler. And so other areas where, for him, my husband is biracial, excuse me, and I think oftentimes having a daughter that is really lighter skin, and me being darker skin, sometimes we have different experiences with our race and ethnicity. So I might be asked if I'm babysitting or if she is adopted, where for him, he can navigate the world a little bit differently with our child. And so that is kind of unresolved, but it wasn't before we had a child. So it's kind of, you know, ongoing, like your point, Martha. So I give this as an example, and now I offer an invitation for you to pick maybe one or two identities and some core people in your life that may have contributed to your understanding of those identities, and reflecting on that handout now. Okay, so not a long time to reflect, but you have every other month. Any quick comments, thoughts about this? Yes, Katie.
I found it interesting. I did age, and I went again one of the relationships with my mother, and I never thought that age would come in this way. But I learned as I become an adult, she doesn't like getting older. Like for her, getting older is like a very bad thing, and for me, getting older has become more of a sense of pride. For me, it's kind of like I made it. Like I made it to another year. Like
Yeah.
And I'm more in line with my dad in that regard. But my mom, it's funny to think that age would be something that we would differ on. I never really thought of it that way.
You wouldn't have predicted it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that as you age, it becomes something that's more prominent, because she wasn't that old when you were a kid.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that really speaks to how this is such a dynamic idea and a dynamic thing that happens. Other questions, thoughts on this?
I just reflected on like when I was a kid versus now, and sort of how we think we've influenced each other, and sort of like, you know, my own experience like being here and like assimilating to this culture versus like, you know, well, first generation, but yeah, and sort of how my parents have responded to the things that I've learned along the way too. They've evolved along the way. So it's like where before it was like disagreed, but now it's like, oh, that sounds like, where are we? I don't know where we are. I don't know if we've had those direct conversations so much lately, but yeah.
This is such a great point you bring up, Raquel, because in the last training I did, one of the people selected their child as, and I said, you know, that's such my lens. I'm not deep into my parenting experience yet. I'm still new, that I hadn't even thought about like the role a teenager might play. And I said, you know, I look at it as the generation ahead of us. I think that's very telling of my age and like bias in that way. But now I need to figure out how to make an intergenerational cultural awareness quiz. So thank you for that point. So we're going to breeze through. So next is the identification and the identification of triggers and manifestation. Really, there hasn't been a lot of attention in the literature looking at how cultural differences and similarities impact our biases. Some of the reactions that happen when we're triggered, I call them the ABCs. So you may respond effectively with fear, anxiety, anger. Behaviorally, in the session, you might be yawning, frowning. You might get too close because you're really excited about that thing and invade their personal space. And then cognitively, there might be judgment. You might diagnose in a certain way, maybe flashbacks of experiences you've had, or really excessive curiosity about their culture. And this relationship kind of goes back and forth. You're stimulated and you respond. You respond and then you're stimulated. And so it's kind of this balance between these two different experiences. When you do have those ABCs, there are 3 ways that you may respond or it may manifest in the room. The first is you may move away from that stimulus. The next is you move towards it and you get really engaged. Finally, you may move against and become really judgmental or critical. I've nicknamed these the avoider. This is when you become more withdrawn. You might refer the patient somewhere else. You might use inappropriate humor. You may use silence. And silence not in a way that it's like meaningful and deep, but silence that makes it really clear we're not discussing this in here. The next is the superhero mode, and this is really what will lead to burnout and compassion fatigue. This is when we have an exaggerated sense of responsibility and think we need to save or can save patients from their experiences. Recently, I had this happen when I had a kid who had experienced some police brutality, and I was like, well, we're gonna go, do you know the officer's badge number? We can go down to the station, file a report, and it was just such, like, this is short-term therapy. I was on the Fox News, like CNN, texting people, like, that is way too much for a warm handoff. So I had superhero mode. And then finally becoming the critic. And this is when we start to notice, like, that irritability, this agitation, some sarcasm, over-pathologizing patients. And so these 3 different responses really have to do with the fact that we are triggered, we're having those affective, behavioral, cognitive, ABC reactions, but we still are feel-good people and we want to stay in the relationship. So we have to adjust our space between ourselves and that trigger. And so it really comes down to like trying to find the right balance. So the patient says something about police brutality, so I really move towards and I over-adjust so I fall off the balance beam. You know, the next one, I realize I fell off, so I'm trying to adjust, and I fall off again because now I'm moving away, and now the patient doesn't feel like I care. And so really, CBC is about finding that perfect balance of how to keep yourself safe in the relationship, how to have that engaged relationship, and give voice to the silent participant in the room, which is culture, which patients rarely get the opportunity to discuss, especially cross-culturally. We're not going to have time for that, but we will in a month and next month. So the last piece is about management, and this is really the regulation process.